Okay, welcome to the lecture for Crisis Intervention, looking at Chapter 10 of Aguilera, talking about substance abuse. So Aguilera spends a lot of time talking about different substances, but here we're going to discuss some of the types of crises people may experience related to substance use, and we'll look at applying the model. In terms of types of crises related to substance use, well, there may be a whole series of legal crises somebody could get into. So, if you're caught in possession of an illegal substance because of you're using it, and depending on the amount, the charge may go up from possession to possession with intent to distribute, and then possible kind of federal charges that have different penalties. Um, there may be, depending on the level of abuse and your financial resources, you may end up resorting to theft to support a habit. You're also probably at an increased risk for being the victim of theft once you start getting more heavily involved in some aspects of drug culture. Also, you may be more likely to perpetrate or be the victim of violent crime, especially if the substance you're abusing is related to changes in impulse control. And then the other one that people, for whatever reason, don't seem to think about too much is involvement with CPS and losing your kids. That's kind of a legal trouble, a crisis, legal trouble related crisis that the likelihood of which increases if you're using and abusing substances. Financial crises, again, depending on what drug you're using, how expensive it is, and what your resources are, you may end up owing a lot of people money. It may involve loss of your possessions, either selling your possessions or getting your stuff repoed because you can't pay the bills, and you can't pay the bills because your priority is spending money on the drug and nothing else. And then kind of the third group would be interpersonal crises. Substance use, not surprisingly, puts a great strain on people's relationships, especially if the relationship is with somebody else who's not using that substance. It also increases the risk of domestic violence, which we've talked about before. Okay, let's talk about Aguilera's model. In terms of the perception of the event, when you're assessing for problematic cognition, some things that you might want to be asking about, thinking about is, do they see that there's a connection between their use and the crisis? So, they're in jail, or they just got beat up, or they just got their stuff stolen. Do they see that, okay, if they hadn't been using, this, whatever happened would have been less likely? Or do they not see that at all? Do they possibly see themselves as a victim, caught up in this kind of other people's stuff, or I'm a victim of society, and they're not taking any responsibility for their use. And the third thing would be, do they see their use as problematic, or they go, oh yeah, it stinks that I got picked up for this. I was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I was stupid. I won't get caught again. Right? So it's not that I'm in all this trouble because I have this problem with my use and I couldn't not use. It's just I was unlucky. So these are a couple of the perceptions you may want to look out for. In terms of how to address these problematic cognitions, we'll talk about two things. One, motivational interviewing is one approach that may be helpful. And it's really about the stance that you take. Trying to get somebody to increase motivation for change. Because most people that are abusing substances don't really want to stop. Right? If they did, they wouldn't be abusing them. They would just be using them. For motivation interviewing, you want to increase their motivation to stop. And to do this, you can't just beat them up over their use. Oh, you're stupid for doing this. Why are you doing this? This is so dumb. Really, you try to get them to do that to themselves, right? By asking questions like, So did this kind of thing happen before you started partying? Using their term rather than using. You want them to be able to see that, you know, the consequences of use aren't worth the benefits of use. And with motivation interviewing, the whole thing is all about the stance about you can't just tell them that. You have to kind of get them to see that by asking questions about, well, what's the good and what's the bad and how's that working for you, kind of thing. Another thing to kind of possibly incorporate with that, another approach would be the trans-theoretical model of change, Prochaska, Norcross, and De Clemente's model, which was developed, I think, originally for nicotine addiction. I'm not sure, but it's been used, applied to a wide variety of behaviors, especially in the addiction context. So let's look a little bit more closely at that trans-theoretical model of change in terms of changing people's perceptions and eventually behavior. So this is all about figuring out where they are in the stage of change and realizing that when people are changing and want to change their behavior, they kind of go through this process, some really quickly, some more slowly, from kind of thinking about it to, okay, I'm going to do it, to taking some steps and then kind of doing, right? And the idea behind this model is you have to meet them where they are and target your intervention to what stage of change they're at. So the first stage of change would be the pre-contemplative stage, so they're not even considering change. Now, I don't have a problem, yeah, it sucks, I'm in jail, talking to you, but whatever. I'm not going to change. There's no reason to. So, if they're at that stage, you want to validate where they are. Okay, so you don't feel like this is a problem. I get that. You want to note that the decision belongs to them. Hey, you want to keep using it? I'm not going to stop you. I can't stop you. It's not possible. Right? But you actually want to invite them to share what they're thinking about the problem and verify their understanding of what's probably going to happen to them if they don't change. And so, okay, so you don't want to stop using heroin, that's cool, but so how long do you figure you can keep using it? If you 10 years, okay, so in 10 years, for the next 10 years, you can use it regularly and really nothing bad will happen. Okay. Anybody else used for 10 years, used heroin for 10 years without ever getting arrested or contracting a disease or overdosing? And you can kind of gently challenge those things. But really, not too much challenging here, just kind of getting them to think about it, right? And make sure they understand what's going on. And then hopefully you can move them to the contemplative stage, and maybe you may even do this in one session, maybe. And this is when they're ambivalent about change. Well, maybe I could quit, maybe I should quit, but I don't want to. So it's like, yeah, I sort of want to, yeah, I sort of don't. So feeling both those things at once. You're going to do a couple things here. So you want to still validate where they are. So you're always building on the previous interventions. But what you want to add here is an exploration of the costs and benefits of change. Okay. And talk about potential positive outcomes. So not just, okay, do you know what's going to happen if you don't stop? Now it's like, okay, well, if you did change, if you did stop using, if you started living healthier, what would that look like? What would be the good stuff that could come out of that? Maybe. Okay. Start focusing on those positives now more than just the kind of the negatives. And if they can move forward from there, they get to the preparation stage. And this is where they may have even tried changing some, right? And they're planning to try something maybe more substantial within the next month. Okay, so yeah, okay, I kind of sort of stopped using it. I think I'm going to try to get clean pretty soon now. I'm ready to do it. Yeah, okay. This is where you can really start talking about social supports and coping mechanisms, and encouraging small steps. So you don't want them to just, as they're in this preparation stage, you want to build some supports for them. Okay, so if you were going to do this, so not now you're going to do this. So if you're going to do this, who could help you? Whenever it gets hard, what might you do? The coping mechanism stuff, right? again, try not to let them jump too far into, okay, I'm going to go completely clean and sober and never drink again and never talk to anybody who I ever have a drink with, and it's all going to be great. You want to encourage baby steps, not really set them up for failure. Now it's time for action. Right? So now they're trying something new, and probably you won't see somebody come in if they're in the action stage, right, for crisis. You'll see them earlier in this, or as we'll see, maybe relapse at the end. But you maybe still be working with them at this point. Probably not in a crisis intervention, but maybe. If you are, you want to do a couple things. One, support their sense of self-efficacy. Okay, yeah, you can do this. Here's why you know you can do this. Address issues of loss related to the change. So now that you're not doing drugs, you don't feel like you can paint as well as when you were smoking heroin all the time. And so talk about that. You don't act like that's not true. What? How do you feel about that? And yeah, that does suck. So acknowledge there are some losses that come with this change in behavior. But then you go back to focusing on, but what are the good things about this change of behavior? And then after they've done something for a while, you get to the maintenance stage. This is when they're able to sustain the new behavior for some period of time. What you want to be working on now is make sure you put in a follow-up plan. Okay, so you're doing this well. How are you going to keep track of this? Check back in with me in 3 months, 6 months, whatever. And you want to reinforce the rewarding nature of change. Well, isn't this so great? Don't you feel so much better? Right? And you also want to plan for relapse. And some people say, oh, how do you want to plan for relapse? What do you want to plan for failure? That's pessimistic. Well, the data say that it's realistic and that most people will relapse at least once. So you want to talk about it. And if you talk about it, you can maybe decrease the impact of relapse. So rather than, oh, you relapse and you start back at zero, if you can talk about the relapse being a slip rather than a fall all the way back to square one, they might get back to action and maintenance much more quickly. If or when they do experience relapse, if this is kind of where they're at, you want to identify what triggered the relapse and then find out what their current motivational stage is. So are they back to, well, now screw it, I can't do this, I'm not going to change, or are they contemplative, or are they preparation, or are they, where are they, and then you start back over where they are and meet them at that stage. So motivation reviewing and the transtheoretical model of change are two kind of things you can use to help people if they have kind of problematic cognition about their substance use. Continuing on with the model in terms of situational supports, one thing that's kind of unique about this problem is the quality of social supports. You really want to assess that and figure out how many people in their support system are clean. Are they other people who are also in recovery? Are they people who aren't in recovery and are current users? Oh well, my friend Chuck, he's still using, but he said he's not going to give me any. He's going to help me get clean. Probably don't want to count on Chuck, right? Another thing to think about is isolation. It's frequently a result of use. People that struggle with substance abuse and addiction often burn a lot of bridges. You kind of have that, I swear it's the last time, I wouldn't lie to you again. And then the people around them pull back and say, okay, I can't do this anymore. Until I see you getting better for real, I'm not going to help you. So it may be harder to plug it into some situational supports that you might typically think would be there because they've really strained those. In terms of financial support, one interesting thing I wanted to tack on here was the research indicates that addicts whose families provide financial support are more likely to relapse. So the kind of support you encourage them to seek is also important. It's not as much about asking people for money, because they'll probably use that to buy drugs, but other types of support in terms of supporting their recovery. AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, and the other variants of it, 12-step programs. Debate in the literature about those programs, but one thing we know for sure is the sponsor aspect of the AA model is really good. It's kind of institutionalized situational support, and that seems to be a really important and effective component of that treatment program. So having somebody who's identified as, I'm going to be there for you any hour of the day, if you're feeling craving, call me, that seems to be a really helpful type of thing. In terms of the legal system, it may be important to help a client reframe their view of the legal system. So kind of getting back to perceptions here. So if they have a probation officer, seeing them as a support rather than a foe. So which can be really tricky for people who have been through the criminal justice system to see it that way. But if they're going to be successful, it would be much easier if they could see the legal system as something that's there to help them, and make use of those resources rather than as something to struggle with and fight with and hide from. Last, there's inpatient, outpatient treatment. Inpatient treatment is pretty helpful for stopping use, right? But not for just completely treating addiction. Right? So usually you need inpatient, or frequently you need inpatient to stop the use, but then you need outpatient to prevent relapse or treat relapse. So often a combination of those two things for adequate situational support. In terms of coping behaviors, more often than not, for people who have addiction, using that substance is their coping behavior. So now, if they're trying to cope with a crisis caused by the substance, and they can't use their substance, they've got a hole there, right? And you've got to fill it with some new coping behaviors and teach them some new things to do. And rather than reinvent the wheel, obviously one thing you want to do is review with them their coping history. So before you use, what did you used to do when you got sad, anxious, angry, whatever? So how did you take care of yourself before you found this other thing? Last for coping behaviors, some clients may need inpatient treatment in order to give them a safe place to learn new coping behaviors. And again, this kind of goes back to just because that substance was their coping behavior, and so if they can't learn new things quick enough, they'll go back to using the substance. Once they go back to using the substance, they're not interested in learning any new coping behaviors. Right? So that's one of the reasons inpatient care may be a good starting point. It gives them a place where they can't get access to drugs, which will give them time to learn some new skills and make it easier when they're then pursuing outpatient care. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about for substance abuse is this idea of equilibrium, which is key to Aguileras' model. We have these balancing factors to restore balance, restore equilibrium, and you're now out of the crisis. And you're maybe not fine, but you're not in crisis anymore, and your job as crisis intervention person is done, and they may or may not need long-term therapy. But for this group, is restoring equilibrium the same thing as achieving abstinence, abstinence from use? So does someone need to stop using completely in order to regain equilibrium? And then the related question to that is there such a thing as safe use? If you have a client who's struggling with addiction, can you imagine a scenario where they don't stop using, but they reduce their use enough that they're no longer in crisis? Or do you consider it, well, if you're using an illegal substance, cocaine, marijuana, heroin, ecstasy, whatever. If you're using it at all, with any kind of regularity, then you are in crisis. And that's one of the things I want to talk about in class, in addition to just applying the model as usual. Okay? Take care.